Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this masterclass organized by the Cluster of Research Excellent in all things AI and computational. Today we have a team of two speakers, both from Coventry University, Dr. Fei He, who will do the first part on signal processing, and Mr. Stephan Goerttler, who will speak later about graph neural networks. Yeah? And since they're all very keen to get this very nice introduction, I would suggest that Dr. Fei He starts immediately with his presentation. And maybe we should keep just for the online participants the questions at the end of each block.
Yes.
We can have a clean recording of the lecture. Yeah. So Fei, please, you're most welcome to start with your presentation. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much for the introduction, Francesco. And today I think we have two parts of this talk. Right? It's a little bit interference somewhere actually. So I will talk a little bit about the signal processing and the graph signal processing in the first part, and also I think my student Stephan will talking a bit more about the graph neural networks in the second part of this lecture. I think, yes, we are in the Coventry University. I think we are in the Center of Computational Science and also Mathematical Modeling, which is actually a research center focused on data science and also AI research. I think Professor James Bruce gave a talk, I think, probably 1 month ago. I think that's both on reinforcement learning. I think both of us actually are from this research center. So today I will give a talk covering those few different topics. I think first about some classical signal processing, linear dynamical systems, and talk a little bit about the linear filtering. And then I want to cover a little bit of the research in my group on the nonlinear signal processing and also the system identification techniques, which has been used for study some neuroscience applications. And later we will also cover some topics of the graph signal processing, graph filter design, and in the end I will give you a relatively real-world examples of how to use this kind of graph signal processing techniques to analyze some neuroimaging data, especially the functional MRI data set. So it's a little bit overview actually of the research in my group. We're trying to measure this kind of brain signals, right? Especially the EEG signals, which capture the brain electrical activities. MEG signals capture the magnetic change of the magnetic fields, and also a little bit on the functional MRI in. So we can measure this kind of brain signals over different regions in the brain. Actually, as you can see in this figure, we have lots of this kind of EEG sensors covering different brain regions, and we measure this kind of signals over time. We have this kind of multivariate time series. And I think my group is mainly focused on extract certain kind of features from this kind of EEG signals, especially the nonlinear dynamics features and also some network features that I'm going to talk a bit more actually in today's lecture. After we have this kind of features, we are trying to perform certain machine learning, or we see the classification tasks, for example, the detections or diagnosis of certain neurological disorders like the epilepsy, the Parkinson's disease, and also Alzheimer's disease. So traditionally, actually, for this kind of brain signals, normally we try to actually filter the signals and actually into different frequency band. Actually, obviously the frequency range. We can have this kind of delta theta in the bottom, which actually are some of the low, relatively low frequency frequencies, and actually we have this kind of beta, gamma, relatively higher frequencies. So I think more traditionally, people trying to actually study the brain functional connectivity between different actually brain regions, actually within each of these frequency range. I think I'm going to cover a little bit about this actually in today's lecture. But actually, there's more research recently to show that the complex brain functions like the memory, learning, actually, and also some calculations, which is actually it covers actually the interactions between different frequencies, right? So actually study those within a specific frequencies actually may not be enough, right? So we actually need to look at this kind of cross-frequency interactions, which is called cross-frequency coupling analysis. And this is actually one of the ongoing research in my group, actually. So if we're looking at this kind of cross frequencies, then we will have actually multi-layer brain networks, right? So actually we have this kind of connections within each frequencies, but also have the cross frequency interactions. So if we just look at two specific brain regions, actually if we can measure this kind of brain signals, we're trying to actually model this kind of interconnections of these two different brain regions. Right? We can use some kinds of reverse engineering, or we call the system identification techniques from the control system engineering to actually model this kind of relationships between two different brain regions, or actually to model this kind of relationship to find the interconnections between some hidden variables. So we can, in general speaking, we can represent this as a nonlinear state space models. Most people know this kind of stuff. And actually, U and V actually are the input-output signals that act as some kind of hidden state variables. So you can use these kind of techniques to study these kind of, we see the causal relationships between two different brain regions. So if everything is linear, it's relatively simple. We have this kind of linear, this kind of autoregressive models. We call it ARX models. We have this kind of input delayed terms, U delayed terms. We have the output delayed terms as our input terms. And then we have the current state of output, YT, is actually our output signals. So actually, we can transform this kind of linear discrete dynamic models actually into this kind of linear time invariant systems representation, which is actually the output signal Y becomes a convolutions of the input signal U with the impulse response function of this linear dynamic system. So the impulse response means actually that if you give an impulse in the input, the corresponding system's response, which is actually the impulse response function. So yeah, so the output just becomes this kind of convolutions between the input and also this impulse response. Right? So if we look at these figures, the first one, which is actually a square input signals, and the second figure plot gives you the impulse response. So if you convolute these two orange signals, you will get your green output signals. Right? So this is actually the classical linear system theory. I guess most of you are familiar with this. And actually, after we do this, we know that the convolutions in time domain, then if we map this to the frequency domain using the Fourier transform, then we know that the convolutions in the time domain then becomes this kind of product, right, in multiplications in the frequency domain, right? So the output spectrum YF then becomes the input spectrum UF multiplied this frequency response functions H. Or we call it transfer functions, right, in the linear dynamic system theory. And actually, because this H is actually a complex number, so actually we can have this kind of board plot diagrams, right? We have the magnitude, we have this kind of phase diagrams, right? We know what is the change of the magnitude from the input to the output, and also what is the phase delay actually between the input and also output signals. The left-hand side shows you, for example, we have we can see this frequency response is kind of filter, right? So actually it's kind of like a low-pass filter, right? In the left-hand side, we have high-pass filter in the right-hand side. But we know actually if we use this kind of linear system theory to study the brain dynamics, right, between different brain regions, sometimes it may not be sufficient, right? We know actually many complex actually brain dynamics actually is nonlinear, right? Actually, from for example between different brain regions, or actually one input is on the surface, the other output is deep inside of brain. Or actually you have a visual system, right? You have stimulus, and actually the response in the brain, which is actually nonlinear. So a very large part of my group's research in the past few years is actually to generalize this theory actually to the nonlinear case. So for the nonlinear case, actually that since we are becoming more complicated, right? So actually we will have this. So this impulse response becomes a high order impulse response. It's not only one terms, we will have the second order, third order terms. And also this kind of convolutions actually will also becomes a bit more complicated. It becomes a multidimensional generalized convolution. But actually we can do it actually, right? We can actually using this kind of nonlinear dynamic models, actually we call it NITheCS models, right? Which is a nonlinear regression models. Right? We have this kind of input, output, delay terms, and also the nonlinear polynomial terms. So we can actually identify this kind of nonlinear regression models in the time domain actually, and actually we can determine the model terms, how many terms in this model, and also actually estimate those model parameters. So we have a systematic approach to do this. And also validate this model in time domain. And then nice thing we can do is actually to map these models to the frequency domain, because it's directly linked with the vector series. As a result, actually we can see that in the frequency domain, not only we have this linear part of this H, right, which is H1, which is similar to the linear system, but also we have some high order this kind of frequency response function, because generalized frequency response functions capture the dynamics of the nonlinearities in the system. And recently, actually, my group has published a software package, right, to do this, right, called system identification for the NITheCS models. So actually, we have some improved functions for the model tensor selection, right, which is more robust and also accurate, and also we reduce the computation power time actually. When we do this kind of model identification process. So if interested, you can have a look at this software package. Yeah, it just gives you a very simple example to show how can we understand this stuff, and also how can we use this kind of nonlinear system theory. So if we consider that we have a relatively simple system, right? The system has actually two parts, right? The first is actually it's a linear part, right? Which is actually, so Y here is actually the system's output frequency spectrum, right? YF, which can be represented as a linear part, which is Y1F, add to the contributions from a nonlinear part, Y2. So the Y1, which is actually basically is a linear part of this system which contributed to the output spectrum, right? We can write this as a classical frequency response function H1F multiply this input spectrum U. And then we have this kind of a little bit more complicated second order terms here, right? Which is actually tells you the how the contributions of this kind of quadratic effects, right, to the output spectrum. Now we have the second order, and we were talking about the quadratic couplings between two frequencies. So actually we have this F1 and also F2 components, right? And also this kind of second order frequency response function is actually you see it's in a three-dimensional space, right? Because you have two frequency axes. So if we just look at the linear part, which is quite simple, right? Because we know it's just a linear transfer function of linear system. So the input has two frequency components. The output also have the same two frequency components, which goes through a linear frequency response function. But only the magnitude of this signal will change. But the frequency components are basically the same. And if you apply the same input to this second order nonlinear terms here, you will see that extra frequency components will be generated in the output, right? Actually, which is that the summations and also subtractions of these two input frequency components, because the harmonics or the intermodulation effects of the nonlinear dynamic system. So this nonlinear properties is actually determined by this second order generalized frequency response function. So especially the ridges and also the peaks in this three-dimensional H2 surface plot, which actually tells you the quadratic couplings between two frequencies from the input to the output. So yeah, we actually use this techniques from the engineering, especially control engineering, to study some of the neuroscience problems. Right, especially my group is probably the first one actually to implement this, to study some important neuroscience problems. For example, actually, when we study the essential tremor, which is important types of neurological disorder, right? We know it affects a lot of peoples. So we actually collaborate with the hospital, right? So actually, the clinicians actually can measure the EEG and also the thalamic local field potentials, which is deep inside of the brain signals, and also the muscle signals EMG in the same time. It's three different types of signals. And actually, we know these complex loops are actually between the cortex and also the local field potential, the thalamic areas. This kind of feedback loops is quite important actually in understanding this kind of the cause and also the of this neurological disorder. So the relationship between the thalamus and also the EMG muscle signals have been quite well studied, which is basically a linear relationship. But the relationship between the EEG and also the thalamic local field potential has not been that clearly studied, right, in kind of literature. So if you apply some classical linear correlation or coherence analysis, right, between those three different types of signals, you can see that the thalamus and EMG has relatively strong linear correlations, but actually you cannot see too much actually, right, between the EEG and also the thalamic signals. So actually, we apply our nonlinear dynamic modeling actually, and also the frequency domain analysis to these two different brain regions, right? So actually, we treat, for example, the EEG as the input, and actually the local field potentials as output. Well, actually, we compute this kind of nonlinear dynamic models using Lux methodology, and then we can map these kind of models to the frequency domain. And here I show you the result is actually the frequency, second order frequency response function, which is this H2 here of these two different conditions. Right? First one is when the tremor is onset, right? The second one is when the tremor is off. So we can see that the second order frequency response characterizes the nonlinear second order properties of this dynamical system. So you can see that here I plot the positions of these ridges here in this three-dimensional plot. Right? So you can see that for the tremor on state, this kind of ridge positions is in a relatively lower frequency, and for the tremor off state is in a relatively high frequency. Which tells you that the energy actually of the input, which is actually the EEG signals, is being transferred to a relatively lower frequencies, right? When the tremor on state, and it's being transferred to a relatively higher frequencies in the tremor off state. So yeah, this is a little bit of research I've been doing a few years ago. I published in the neuroscience. And also we have written a review paper actually that if you're interested, actually we're trying to draw the links between the non-dynamical systems with the effective connectivity that have been widely studied in the or with the causality studied in the neuroscience. So we're trying to make this kind of links between the linear, nonlinear dynamical systems with the corresponding linear and also nonlinear causality measures. How can we study this within the system identification techniques? So we have talked about quite a lot actually so far about applying the linear dynamical systems or nonlinear dynamical system theory to study the interconnections, I would say, actually, or the causal relationships between two specific brain regions, right? We have one input, we have one output, right? So actually, we can identify, for example, a linear filters or nonlinear filters to represent this kind of relationships. But we know actually for many complex actually brain functions, actually, or some of the complicated tasks, for example, if you want to design a brain-computer interface, or if you want to understand actually the properties of complex brain disease or complex neurological disorders, just looking at one or two brain regions often not enough, right? So actually, because the disease actually can affect a wide range of brain regions. As a result, actually, we need to study this actually in a more broader actually brain regions, right? Not only one or two channels, but actually we want to look at this through all the whole brain networks. So actually, the question is how can we study the dynamics actually, right, through actually a brain on top of a brain network. So whether we can generalize actually the theory that we are familiar with for the classical signal processing actually onto this kind of brain networks. So this is why actually we introduce actually these techniques called the graph signal processing. So actually now first thing we do is actually we want to construct these kind of brain networks, right, from our brain signals that measured in different brain regions. And actually this is from our neurophysiological signals that we can see over here. After we construct this network, actually, then we can map our signals actually onto this kind of brain network. Right? So actually, for example, if you take two slides over time over here, you can see that the first, if you pick up all the brain activities at a specific time point and you put this into the graph, you will see this is the one graph signal, right? And then if you take another time point, you take a slice, and we pick up these signals, we have another graph signal. So actually, we're trying to study actually how the signals in the graph varies actually, right, over the time. Yeah. So actually, can we actually also develop some kind of filters, actually, which is similar to the classical linear time-varying system, right, to describe the relationships between those two different graph signals. That is the things actually I want to talk a little bit actually in the next few slides. So the first thing actually, how can we construct this kind of brain network, right? So actually, there are many different approaches can be used, right, to do this kind of network, and normally the simplest way you can probably just use the distance, right, between different sensors, right, to actually to construct this kind of network. But also yes, other approaches. For example, I showed here you can use this kind of called functional connectivity, actually, which is calculate the correlations actually between different brain regions to construct this kind of brain network. So here actually we have this kind of fMRI, functional MRI neural image, right, which is measured over time, right? So actually, so this fMRI we know that actually is trying to measure the brain activities through the measure of the variations in the blood flow, or we see the changes in the oxygen level, right? So this we can measure this as an image, and then we can if you pick up this in a specific brain regions and plot this over time, you will get this kind of signals actually changing over time. And actually, we can do this for a number of different brain regions. Right? So we have lots of this kind of signals, brain signals. So if you pick up two signals from two different brain regions, and if you compute the person correlations, right, you will be able to compute one of these values, in this big matrix. So this matrix is called the correlation matrix, or we call it functional connectivity matrix. The dimension of the matrix is the same as the number of brain regions that you are going to study. So this one looks like you have probably quite a lot of hundreds of brain regions. So this is actually a matrix to describe this kind of correlations between different brain regions. And then sometimes we can actually further simplify this kind of correlation matrix by either you can binarize actually your correlation, so it becomes either 0 and 1, or you can set up a threshold here actually to remove some of the weak connections. Right? So actually this is to further simplify the graph, or we see you're trying to make the numerical computation is a bit more stable. So the adjacency matrix here, basically, as I said, is you can just use this kind of functional connectivity or the correlation matrix as your adjacency matrix. It can be directed, right? It can be undirected, right? According to different situations. And actually, sometimes we also want to use this kind of Laplacian matrix, right, which is actually the degree matrix. Myers actually, our adjacency matrix. And both of them actually are being used actually in the graph signal processing. And very often, if we have a directed graph, normally we use the adjacency matrix. If it's undirected, and very commonly we use the Laplacian matrix. So I mean, sometimes we also call this is a graph shift operator. I'm going to tell you in the next slides. Adjacency and also Laplacian matrix can be used as graph shift operator. So if you look at if you put one signals at one time frame actually into this graph, we will have one of these graph signals, right? So actually, mathematically, actually, you can represent these graph signals just using as a vector. And also, as said before, the adjacency matrix or the Laplacian matrix can be served as this graph shift operator, right? Which is here I use S here to denote this graph shift matrix. So if you multiply your graph signal X with this kind of graph shift operators, basically you're doing this kind of graph shift, right? So actually, basically you can see in this graph, in these figures here, you have one signals at a specific node. So you just propagate these signals to all the other neighborhoods, right? Which is all the other nodes who is connected to these specific nodes. So if you do this kind of operations here, basically you actually diffuse your signals into the neighborhoods. You can do this using the adjacency, do this using Laplacian. A very extreme case, right, of the network, or we see probably one of the simplest case of the network, which is this kind of cyclical circle, right? So actually the nodes actually is being connected one by one as a circle. And here we have 6 nodes, right, x1 to x6. And actually, yes, the arrows here shows you the directions of this network, right? And actually, we can represent this network using this specific adjacency matrix, right? So with one means there's one connection and zero there's no connection. But also we notice this A matrix is not symmetric, right? Because we have directions over here, right? If you look at the first row here, representing the connections of the first nodes over here, you can see that only the last one, the 6, has one over here, because only node 6 will come into this next one. Okay. So this is actually agency matrix describe the structure basically of this network, and also we have this kind of graph signals here, X, which is the values on top of these 6 nodes. So if you multiply this graph shift operator adjacency matrix A with your graph signal X, you actually do this kind of graph shift operation, right? So if you think about this, you have 6 signals over here, and you multiply this with this shift operator A matrix, you actually rotate those signals clockwise to the next position. Okay. I mean, if you think about each of these nodes here as a time instant, right? If you think this is time instant, and each of the signals here is just like a time series signal. So if you this kind of graph shift operations is very similar to the time delay operation, right? That we studied in a linear signal process, classical signal process. So this example is also a very nice example actually to draw the links between the classical signal processing with the graph signal processing. Because if you look at the eigendecompositions of this adjacency matrix, you'll find that you get the eigenvalues and also eigenvectors, right? If you do eigendecomposition, you'll find that the eigenvectors here are basically the basis of the discrete Fourier transform. Okay? This is basically this, basis of discrete Fourier transform. And those eigenvalues here, lambda here, actually gives you the frequencies. Okay, so we have these nice examples, cyclic graph examples. Then actually, you can further generalize this graph shift operations to the more general networks. Not necessarily a cyclic network, can be any networks. As a result, actually, we can do this kind of graph, actually Fourier transform, which is in a similar way as the classical Fourier transform, right? So we know actually in the classical Fourier transform, we decompose our signals into lots of Fourier bases, right? And we map these signals into those Fourier bases. And here we do this in a similar way. We actually compute this kind of graph Fourier basis through the eigendecompositions of the Laplacian matrix. And here these eigenvectors here, U here gives you this kind of graph Fourier basis. So this examples here is actually the 5 EEG signals that in 5 brain regions. You construct the Laplacian matrix through the basic correlation between different signals. And then you decompose your Laplacian using the eigendecompositions, and you will get these 5 eigenvectors. So you can see that the first 2 eigenvectors is corresponding to the eigenvectors of the low frequencies. You can see they represented the Fourier basis of these relatively low frequencies. And you can see that there's not too much variations in this graph signal. It's actually a graph signal, right? But actually it's represented as a Fourier basis. And this U4, U5, which is corresponding to the basis of high frequencies, and you see there are much more variations. So actually now we can do the Fourier transform, right, in the graph domain. So next thing actually we can do is actually now we can do the Fourier transform, and actually then we can map our transform our signals into the Fourier domain using the graph Fourier transform. Right, it's very simple. You just multiply your graph signal x here with your eigenvectors, right, which is your Fourier basis, ut, and then you can convert your graph signals into the frequency domain, right, which is graph spectrum actually called. And also you can do the inverse Fourier transform, actually that from the frequency domain back into the vortex domain. And also you can represent this, right, as a frequency domain representation of this kind of linear dynamical systems. You have input spectrum, output spectrum, and you have a filter in the middle, right, which is actually the frequency response function of this linear system. Again, actually, you can do the inverse Fourier transform actually of this, and then you go back to the time vortex domain, not time domain, and then you can see the future representations in the vortex domain. But actually, we know that for very large, especially for large networks, right? If you do this kind of eigendecompositions, sometimes can be very costly, right? So actually, we want to simplify this through this kind of Chebyshev polynomial expansion. So if we do this actually, and actually we can represent these kind of things as a polynomial of this Laplacian matrix, right, until the order of k. So this k here normally is much smaller than the overall dimensions of your number of channels, right? And also you don't need to do this kind of eigendecomposition here because you just directly use Laplacian matrix, which is computationally much more efficient. Here I just represented this actually using the graph shift operator, right, to replace your pair here using this kind of graph shift operator here, which is more general expression. And you can see this expression here actually gives you this kind of like a graph convolution, right? So actually you have this kind of shift operator. You propagate your signals once, and you multiply another shift operator. You further propagate your signals. So actually, if you add this all together, which just gives you like a convolution, right? That we have come across in the classical signal processing. So this is called the Laplacian polynomial filter, or sometimes we call it graph convolution filter, right? Because it's representations of convolution. Yeah, of course, we have the filters. We also sometimes very more interested to see what's the properties of these filters in the frequency domain. So we just decompose this using the eigendecompositions here, and then we know this is actually a one graph Fourier transform, and you move this u to the other hand of the equations, you have another graph Fourier transform, and you can represent this in the frequency domain. Okay, so the things in the middle, this part, which is actually the frequency response of this graph feature. And actually, yeah, we can from this we can actually see whether it's low pass, it's high pass, or it's band pass filter. So that's pretty much most of the theory I want to talk today. Actually, of course, there are many other concepts actually, and also many different types of filters. Graph filters can be designed in practice, but I just talk about some of the most simple ones today. And here gives you one example here actually, and I put the code actually of this in one online link. I will give this to you later on. So this example is actually a functional MRI actually computer imaging data, and measured from one person. So actually we know actually I've already introduced what is the fMRI. So actually it has 360 brain regions. Right? So actually you have this rows here of this figure shows you 360 brain regions, and we have 1,200 time points. This is measured. It's not only one image, we have 1,200 images. So we represent those data, actually we can represent data in this kind of matrix form. and we can visualize this. Okay? Right. So yeah, if you take slides over here, right? So you take at a specific time point. Actually, if you will get 360 data points, right? Which is actually brain activity at this specific time points. If you measure this, if you map these 360 points to the brain regions, you will get one of the graphs. And of course, first thing we want to do is to construct this kind of brain network, right? So using this kind of functional connectivity or correlation analysis to construct this kind of brain connectivity matrix, right? Using the correlation. And then sometimes we also want to set up a threshold here, right? To further refine this brain network, right? Actually, to reduce complexity. I also give you a little bit code over here in Python, how to compute the degree matrix, how to compute this Laplacian matrix. So after we have this brain network, this matrix, and then actually we can do the eigendecompositions, right, of this Laplacian matrix. Okay. So you can decompose the Laplacian into the eigenvalues and also eigenvectors. So lambda is a diagonal matrix, has all the eigenvalues. U and U is actually like a vector matrix. And actually, again, I plot this U gives you the graph Fourier basis, as I mentioned before, right? So this first, what we see is the Fourier modes, actually, right? So the first and second actually are the lowest frequencies, right? And then you can see that the Fourier basis actually that you can see there's the first one basically is a constant value, right? There's no variations. The second one has a little bit variations, right? But relatively slow variations across the brain regions. But if you look at the 200 and also 350, right, which is corresponding relatively higher frequencies, you can see quite significant local variations, right, in some brain regions. This is actually corresponding to the classical actually signal processing. You have some, if you do the Fourier transform, you have some very slow sine waves, you have some very fast sine waves. Now actually we're talking about it in the graph. So this is visually you can see the difference, but actually there's one measure actually we can use to measure the smoothness of the graph, which is called the total variations. Right? Sometimes we also call this the Laplacian quadratic form. So this delta x here actually measures the local difference between nodes with these neighborhoods, right? What is the differences of these graph signals with these neighbors? If this kind of difference is very significant, then you have very large total variation. If this kind of difference is very small, you have a very small total variation. So you apply this to the variations to those Fourier modes that I showed you in the previous slide. You can compute the total variations for each of these Fourier modes. And mathematically speaking, each of these is corresponding to the corresponding lambda I, which is actually the corresponding frequencies. Here actually I plot all these lambdas over here, right? We have 360 lambdas from the small to the large. You can see the first one, which is 0, right? Because there's no variations, right? In the first basis. Okay. And now we know how to do the Fourier transform and decomposition, and now we can design filters, right? We can design a graph filter, right, using some most simple ways. Actually, we know the filter representation is just a diagonal, right, matrix, right? So we can actually set up. If you here, for example, we want to design a low-pass filter, we just set up those eigenvalues, right, which corresponding to the low frequencies to be a relatively high value, and those eigenvalues to the high frequencies to a very low value, for example, 0. And this kind of low-pass graph filter, and actually we can apply this kind of graph filters actually to our graph signal, which is our brain signals. So the top figure shows you the original fMRI signals, right? So actually 360 channel regions is over time. Each slice over here is one graph signal. So actually I plot all the graph signals over here. And if you do this, if you multiply these graph signals with your graph filter, right? Low pass filter, which I showed you in the previous slides, you will get this. After you do the signals, graph signals go through the filter, you will get your output, right? So this is your output you get. The graph, another graph signals that already been low pass filtered. So if you look at this closely, you can see that actually it's a little bit high frequency noise. You can see it's actually being reduced, okay, in the lower plot. If we look more closely, for example, if we take a slice at a specific time point, right, and we compare these two plots, we just take a slice, we take one graph signals, and actually we will see something like this. So this is actually the original graph signal at a specific time point. After you go through these low pass graph filters, you will have another graph signal. Okay? So you can see that there's lots of high frequency variations. You can see that this very extreme red and also extreme blue dots has been suppressed or reduced after you do this kind of low pass graph filter. All right, so this is actually how you design a filter. But in practice, you can also identify a filter, right, from your input-output graph signals. Right? This is actually for the same data set. Actually, we also do this kind of identify these kind of filters. Right? We use actually the current time step signals as outputs, the past 3 time points as your input. Right? So we have 3 inputs at the past time points. We have 1 output at the current time point. And actually, we use graph convolution filters that I introduced right at one of the slides here to represent this kind of graph. And actually, we can estimate the parameters of this graph convolution filter. And actually, here we can also do using the classical vector autoregressive models, right, which is there's no graph representations, it's just metrics, but we also use the past 3 time points data set. So we compare the result of our graph-based approach with the more traditional multivariate regression approach, and here I shows you the model's prediction result. Okay, so these blue curves here is the true signal, right? And actually those green dashed lines here shows you the model's predictions from your graph filter. Okay, so after you do the graph filter, and those orange dashed lines here is actually from the classical vectorized regressive model. You can see that our graph-based approach actually gives you a little bit better actually model's prediction. So I'll give you all the code of this actually in a link actually online. So if you're interested, you can have a little bit play of those kind of concepts of the graph signal processors. Yeah, I guess Stephan will talk a bit more about this graph neural network things. I think the graph signal processing is also a very important, obviously, the key ingredients actually of the graph neural networks, right? Because a very important type of graph is called the spectral graph neural networks, right? Which is actually based on the graph signal processing with the graph convolution filters. And actually, this is one review paper from my group, actually published last year. Investigate actually how can we use this kind of graph neural networks to study the brain signals, especially to the classification tasks actually of the brain signals. If you're interested, you can take a look at this review paper. Yeah, finally, I would like to thank my collaborators and also many of my students who is sitting here to being involved in this nice piece of work actually. And yeah, I think I hope I take too much time actually, and I think that we can have a little bit break actually until the 12 o'clock. And also, I'm happy to answer your questions regarding this lecture. Thank you very much. Not sure if any questions online, please. There's one question online here to see which features actually of brain signals do you use actually to construct a correlation matrix. I think normally we just use the original raw brain signals, raw EEG signals, right? And then we just compute the person correlations actually between those EEG signals actually. But of course, normally you need to ensure actually the stationary actually of those signals, right? If these signals actually are sometimes a very long time, actually it might not be stationary. If you use method to interpret EEG signals spatially, i.e., can you infer the signals at a time point in the brain that does not being sampled actually? You can actually use this method to smooth your signals in the spatial domain actually, right? For example, you can remove some high frequency noise through this kind of graph filters. So has not been sampled actually. Yeah, I think it's a good question actually. Probably you can actually, but normally we don't, for EEG signals actually, normally we don't have too many missing values, right, in the EEG signals. Yeah, of course you can do predictions, right? As actually in the last example, you can do predictions after you go through this kind of graph filters. So actually, yes, in theory, actually if you can make predictions, then actually you can actually to replace this kind of missing values, right, in the future time steps. Great, thank you. Nice question. Ali,
in the 20 pages, you mentioned we could use a threshold to transform the correlationship to the adjacent matrix. So I just want to ask how to set in this threshold. Maybe use a creative algorithm, or and it's just a manual setting.
I think yeah, you can simply this way you can manually set a threshold value actually, but also you can use some kind of like some more advanced approach, like some spatial filters actually, right, to run these kind of tasks. Yeah.
Because I think it is a very important hyperparameter.
Yes.
Just like how many connectivity will be saved to improve the further model.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. Thank you. Yes, I think we can. Yeah, if you know further questions, I think probably you can have a little break. I think probably Stephan has to set up your computers. So it's still using this audio, right? Yeah. Now you can connect yours. Just the
you need to share your presentation in Zoom so the people in South Africa can see it.
Yeah, it is right.
Okay, so why do you turn to this?
Just so that it's also on here.
But it will also be shared with us because we're on Zoom.
Oh, right. Yeah. Great. Can you see the slides actually? For those of you online, can you see the presentation slides? I assume they can at some time. Any marks? That's fine. Okay, so okay, just to double check, can you hear me online? Yeah. Yes. Okay. Perfect. Okay. Then we'll start with the second part of this masterclass. So Fei already talked about the sort of the classical approach to using graphs. Now this will use the machine learning based approach for using graphs. And yeah, I'm a PhD researcher with Fei. I'm a fourth-year student in a collaborative PhD program with Coventry University and the Ace Institute in Singapore. And I'm very happy to be here. Okay, I think in order to understand graph neural networks, it's good to go through some neural networks examples. The first example I have here is just a very simple time series classification example. So we have a time series. Then we cut out samples from this time series. So here, this is just the heartbeats. So each sample is a heartbeat now. The heart can be in several conditions, and then the goal is to train a model such that we can feed the samples through the network to find out the class or the condition that the heart is in. Yeah, so it's a very, very simple example. So we will work with this data set later on, so that's why I already show it. I work with brain signals measured using electroencephalography. And here one problem is that we measure the EEG signal during sleep. And then we are trying to classify those samples into different sleep stages. So we're trying to figure out whether a person is dreaming or whether a person is awake or in deep sleep. Of course, there's many other time series classification examples. Okay, so another problem in neural networks is time series annotation. So here, for example, we also have EEG signal, but unlike before, now the goal is to find segments in this data that relate to a specific condition. So for example, here the first segment would be normal activity, and then the second segment here would be a seizure. So this is useful for epileptic patients. Okay, so let's move to a slightly different example. Probably also very familiar with this one, image recognition. So we have images, and we want to
find out what objects there are in this image. So here you can see we have an image of a train, and then a neural network should sort of recognize this object and give us the label train. And likewise, there's also image segmentation where we have images. I hope you can see them, they're quite small. But in those images, there's, for example, people, and the goal is to find segments of people, segments of trees, for example, here, segments of a river. Yeah, so this is image segmentation. Now, some of you might have noticed that image segmentation and time series segmentation is kind of the same thing in the sense that we're trying to find segments with a specific condition or semantic label. And image classification and time series classification is kind of similar. Okay. So now let's look at what the structure is behind this data. Because if we have a time series, let's say we measure 3,000 values, then we don't just have those 3,000 values, but for each value we also have a time measurement. So we kind of get this time structure with it. And the time structure is kind of very sorted. So we have subsequent time points. Like one value could be close to other values in this time series, and so on and so forth. I think usually we don't think about it because it's always there. So this is kind of a subtle point here that we always have this structure underneath it. Same goes for images. Yeah, here, for example, we have a two-dimensional grid. So these are the pixels, of course. For example, if we have a colored image, we would have 3 values associated with each of those pixels. If we have a black-white image, it would only be 1 value. But we always have that structure underlying it. So these structures are Euclidean structures. They're highly regular, and there's some sort of notion of proximity and directionality. But of course, we are actually more interested in graphs. So the one thing I wanted to realize is that these already are graphs. So the time axis can already be thought of as a time graph, and the pixels of this image can also be thought of as a spatial graph. So usually you probably don't think of them as graphs because they're so highly structured. And when you think of graph, you may think of something more like up here, but they are graphs nevertheless. So that means we could also use graph neural networks in those examples. I'll tell you later why that's not necessarily a good idea, but it is possible. We can do that. And the idea now is that the data that we have kind of sits or lives on those graphs. So we have the graph and the values are kind of on top of this. But the meaning and the behavior of the data that we have is shaped by the topology. And if you think of image image classification, image segmentation, we'd usually use convolutional neural networks here. And those networks actually make heavy use of this underlying structure that we have here. Okay, so I want you all to get a bit involved and maybe think for a short while of data that is living on non-Euclidean graphs. Okay, I guess you all had some time to think. I'll show you some examples. One common example is, for example, a social network. Yeah, a social network. Here the nodes are people, and the edges are the relationships between those people. But we also have data for each node. So the data is not really everything about the person, the personal data or the hobbies, anything. Yeah. So another example of a graph would be just molecules. So here the nodes are atoms, and the edges maybe are bindings between those atoms. and the data on this node may, for example, be the atom type. So for some atoms we have it can be a carbon atom or a nitrogen atom. Yeah. So something that I'm particularly interested in, or our group is interested in, is brain networks, of course. We have different brain regions, and those brain regions are physically connected, so that's a structural connectivity, but yeah, they're also functionally connected. And the data that we might have for each brain region, at least if we're working with EEG, is, for example, the distribution of frequencies. Do we have lower frequencies or higher frequencies in those EEG signals? Okay, there's many more examples. Maybe one I will highlight is citation network. That's, I think, relevant to all of us. It's consists of papers. So the papers are, yeah, published work. They are the notes, and the edges are the references between them. Now, which other papers at paper sites. And the data on the notes can be anything relating to that paper, such as the keywords, like the abstract, or frequency of words. Yeah. Okay. I think I already hinted at this a little bit. There can actually be several types of data for the same graph, and I guess it all depends on what data you have available, and also what you kind of want to do with the data. Okay, let's look at graph characteristics, because actually those graphs can be very, very different. Yeah, or the scenarios that we have are very different. We look at the social network, for example. In the case of Facebook, we have one graph, so that's all of Facebook, and the number of nodes would be about 3 billion. Yeah, maybe every other person on this world is in Facebook. And there's many more edges, so many more friendships between those people. Yeah. But for example, if you look at molecules, this is actually a data set we'll be having a look at later on. In this data set, we have 130,000 different molecules, so quite a lot of graphs, but each graph only has about 9 nodes or less. So this is the number of atoms, the molecules that the data set captures. And in the case of the brain network, for example, we have the number of participants, maybe the number of graphs that we have available, and the number of nodes is then depends on how many sensors we have in EEG, at least how many sensors we have to measure the data, and so on. So the size is very different, but also the ratio between the number of edges and the number of nodes can be very different. But what's also different is the amount of data we have per node. Yeah, in the case of the social network, we have a lot of data per node, like everything that's maybe relating to that one person, or everything that this person on Facebook likes or posts about themselves, or their personal information and hobbies. Is in the case of molecules, this might actually be just, okay, what type of atom is it? Is it a carbon atom or a nitrogen atom? Yeah. And one thing that I also want to highlight here is, in the case that we have one graph, that's already quite different from the neural network examples we saw in the beginning, because here we always assume that we have many samples. Like if you do image recognition, you train the model with many images and not just with one image. But in graph neural networks, sometimes you can use really just one graph and to work with this data. Okay, let's think about what we can do with the data, and what specific categories of tasks we have in when working with graph neural networks. So one type of task is a graph level task. So this is just, okay, we have several graphs, like in the molecule example, and we want to classify them or maybe even do regression with them. And of course, this in the classical case, this would relate to the sort of time series classification. Now we have one whole sample and we just want to find a label for this one sample. We have one image and we want to find a label for this image. There's also node level tasks. So now we have a graph and we want to find labels for each node. So we want to annotate them. So this is of course related to time series annotation, where for each time point we want to find a label, like this is just which segment we're in. And this is also related to image segmentation, where for every pixel we want to find a label. Like, is it a pixel of a person or a pixel of a tree? So while annotations of the semi-supervised variant, there's also the, if you don't have any labels at all for any of the nodes, then we can also do clustering, and that would be the unsupervised version for node level tasks. Okay, but there is one new type of task that we have now that we don't have in the classical case, and that's edge level tasks. So the reason why we don't have this for Euclidean structures is because the structure is already there. The structures are fixed. You know, there's not two edges that all of a sudden we would want to remove, because you know that's just there. Same with time graphs. The time graph is just there. But if we have more irregular topology, it might just be that we don't have the right graphs yet, that maybe some of the edges are missing, or could also be that graphs change over time, or the different samples have different graphs. So this really opens up a new category of tasks that we work with. Okay, so I'll go through each of these one by one. We start with graph level tasks. Here the example is the data set already mentioned earlier, molecules. Specifically, it's the QM9 data set. So we have 130,000 molecules, which are the graphs now, up to 9 atoms, which are the nodes. And we have node features, we have the atom type. There's something else that we have now that we wouldn't have in classical neural networks, and that is edge features. So the edges can also have some meaning. Like it could be bond types. In this specific data set, we then have 19 labels for each graph as a whole. And these are things like the dipole moment, the polarizability, and so on. So some of these are not binary, but continuous variables. So this is why this task would be graph level regression. And this is actually, so the message passing neural network implemented by Goerttler et al. Is actually one of the most famous examples of a GNN, or most successful as well. Was from 2017. The reason it works so well is that it sort of simulates this graph neural network sort of simulates the dynamics in those molecules, and if you then read them out and classify them, you just have a better picture of how those molecules work. And I think this is why the classification here works so well. Okay, let's come to our second example. This is an example of a node level task, the citation network. So we will be working with this in a little while. Specifically, we have the CoRE data set. It consists of 3,000 papers and 4.7 thousand references. So here you see we only have one graph. So that's already different from the neural network case, the classical approach. but we have a lot of data per node. So this is why we can still do deep learning. Yeah. So the node features specifically are a bag of words. So it's just the kind of which words appear frequently in the paper. Each paper is assigned one of 6 labels, which is just the topic or the field of the paper. Okay, the task now is specifically semi-supervised learning. Some of the nodes are labeled, about 3.6%, and we want to find the labels for all the other papers that are not labeled yet. So this is an example of node level classification, because we want to annotate each node, which is now paper, each node with a label. And here a very, very famous example is by Welling from 2017, just the first occurrence of graph convolutional networks. And there's actually a few variants of graph convolutional network that they introduce here. They introduce graph convolutional networks, and they perform quite well on this data set, about 70% accuracy. Okay, let's turn to the last type of task that might be there. And this is edge level, the edge level tasks, of course. Specifically, you want to look at missing link prediction. So now we take the example of Facebook as a social network. I already said that okay, there's maybe 3 billion users and 500 billion friendships, roughly. We have the node features, kind of everything we have about the person on Facebook. And now the task might be to predict the missing links. So 2 people may be friends in real life, but they just haven't connected on Facebook yet. So Facebook wants to try to predict those friendships, and so they can make a suggestion for you, the category of people you may know. You can then, yeah, so this is an example of a missing link prediction task. Okay, so to understand the graph convolutional network, we start with a normal one-dimensional convolutional layer. Specifically here, we look at a filter of size 3 that is convolved with a signal. So the signal is the uppermost bit here. Fei already mentioned the mathematical description that we would have here. So we would sort of formulate the signal as a vector, and the filtering can then be just a multiplication with a filter matrix F. Fei also introduced the shift matrix A already. So here in this case, we have all the different values, and the shift matrix will just shift them to the next value and then shift them again to the next value. So the shift matrix is really just a matrix. Now, multiplication of this matrix with the vector is kind of doing the shift. Okay, just ignore for now what's happening at the edges. It's a bit more complicated, but that's not relevant. Okay, then we can sort of construct the filter as a polynomial in the shift matrix. So in other words, we have the signal, we multiply maybe with the first filter value, then we shift the signal, multiply with the second filter value, and shift the signal again, multiply it with the third filter value. And then all that's left to do is kind of add all of those up, and we get the convolved signal at this particular point. So in a way, this convolved signal point really just accumulates all the first 3 values here of this vector, for example, and these are weighted. So this right here is also something you've seen in Fei's talk already. Now we can sort of think of a convolutional layer. It's simplified maybe is, okay, we have a signal here. It's just a time signal. We convolve it with this filter matrix, and then usually convolutional layer would also have a non-linearity. You probably also add a bias term at one point, so I haven't shown this here. But yeah, this is kind of how we can think of a convolutional layer. Okay, so I leave this up here while we are sort of thinking about the graph convolutional layer. And one variant, one graph convolutional network layer variant that kept getting introduced is the first order variant. So it's given like this. I hope you see a few familiar faces. So for example, we have the shift matrix A here, which is just the adjacency matrix of the graph, of course. But unlike before, we normalize it. Yeah, we also have the signal X. Okay, but unlike before, we don't just have one value per node, but we have maybe 10 or 20 values of features per node. So those 10 or 20 features would be in different columns. So this is why we don't have a vector anymore, but we have a matrix. Same goes for the weight matrix, so theta. Well, this was a scalar before, now that becomes matrix. And that matrix, you can have a look at the dimensions here. The data matrix X is the number of nodes times the number of features. And for everything to match, this has to be the number of features times the number of channels. So this is where we have the channels in graph convolutional networks. Okay. Okay, the normalization is not so important for now, but maybe just remember that it's done using the degree matrix that we've also seen earlier in Fei's talk. And the other thing I wanted to see here is that, of course, it's first order, so there's no higher terms yet. But let's try something that probably not many people do or tried before, but let's try to emulate a one-dimensional CNN through a GCN. Yeah. So the idea is that, okay, we have a graph convolutional network and a time signal is already a graph, so we should be able to use a graph convolutional network on that sort of data. Okay, so we have a sample that's here. We have our equation for a graph convolutional network layer, which is here. And we want to do something that does something similar to what we see in it. Now, in this, in the case of a linear time graph, it turns out the graph is already normalized because we just have in each row we just have one value 1. So we can just drop the normalization thing here. We also have only one value per node. Just remember that each of those time points are nodes now of this graph. So for each node we have one value, so one feature. And just to simplify things, let's set the number of channels to 1. And let's not use a non-linearity for now. Then this is essentially what we're left with. Okay, we have an input signal X, and this is what we do if we feed it to a GCN layer. Okay, but in the 1D CNN, we have those higher terms. And in order to emulate them, we just pass the signal through 2 layers. And then we end up with this equation here. So we parameterized theta here. So we have a different theta here. Some of you might have noticed that, okay, here we had 4 parameters. Now we only have 3 parameters left. But that's not a problem. It just means there's some collinearity. So yeah, some parameters are just not affected. But the model would still be as expressive as a 3-parameter model. Okay, so this is already quite similar. We add a nonlinearity for the last layer so that this becomes the same here. And then one more thing that we usually have when we're working with 1D CNNs is we don't just have one filter, we have several filters. And those several filters then become the feature maps, or and this is the channel dimension in CNNs. But I just want you to be aware that the channel dimension in those feature maps is kind of different than the channel that we have for GCNNs. Yeah, it's not one-to-one. But in order to emulate this 1D CNN now with those different layers, what we have to do is we have to have a separate pathway for each new filter. Okay, so let's just say we have a CNN with 16 filters, or layer with 16 filters, then we would have 16 different pathways here. Okay, so this brings us to our first experiment. I have the code up here. Okay, I hope we can still see the. Okay. I don't think you can see this yet. Let me just share the stuff with you. Okay, you can see this now. Okay, you can, if you're interested, you can look at the code on my GitHub page. I have it there, and you can download it. The data set you'll be working with here is the ECG 5000 data set. So this is just 5,000 samples. Each sample has 140 time points, so it's a very small data set. So if you download this, you need to create a new folder, call it data, and then put this data set in this folder. But this is also described here. Yeah. If you look at this data set, this is the data set. This is where you can download it, and yeah, let's see the description. It's a small data set that's, I think, easier to work with. Here we only have 5 classes. Okay, let me show you how this works. We have, of course, our main function. So this is where you can run experiment 1 or experiment 2. Right now we're running experiment 1. So this is the one parameter you need to feed into the need to give as an argument when you run this main function. Okay, so we load the ECG 5000 data set. So this was the samples of the heartbeats, in case you forgot. Okay, and then we're running 2 models. One is the GCN model that's sort of trying to do the same as the CNN, and then we have a simple CNN model. So those models should roughly do the same thing, but one does it as a graph neural network, and the other one as a normal CNN. Okay.
Excuse me, Stephan, can you make me a little bit bigger?
Yeah, it's quite hard to see.
Use Command plus on your Mac.
Yeah, I think it's also in settings. Okay, is this better?
Yeah.
Or should I make it bigger? A little more? Okay, no problem. This was, okay, 150. Okay.
Thank you.
So, okay, you can see that all right. We have the model class here. And we just define a linear time graph here. This is just this shift matrix that we've also seen earlier today. Now we need quite a lot of layers, GCN layers. Like we need 5 layers to emulate those 5 kernel size of 5 in a CNN, and we need 16 different pathways to emulate those 16 channels that we have in a 1D CNN. So what we actually have here is 80 different GCN layers to emulate 1D CNN with 16 channels and 5 kernel size of 5. Okay, so we have these layers here, and at the end we just have classification layers that just give us the classes. So if you look at one of those layers, this is just the first order layer. We need the normalized adjacency matrix. So this is here. One of the variables we have here. We need to initialize the weights, and if we call this layer, so basically what we do is multiplication of the input vector with the weight matrix here, and on this side we have just the matrix multiplication with normalized adjacency matrix with the input vector. We need to do it in a bit more complicated way with Einstein's summation because we have batches. But I wanted to see that this is essentially just, if we just go back here, this is just this right here. Okay, let's just run this. This is a little slow. Oh, okay, there we go. Okay, while this is running, we can already see that we have 245 trainable parameters. So some of those are the GCN layer parameters, but others are also the parameters of the classification layer, the fully connected layer at the end. Okay. This is a little slow, so while I think it's slower because of the Zoom call at the same time. Okay, while this is running, we can maybe go back here and ask you the question: do you think that what we're running right now is a graph level task, a node level task, or edge level task? Okay, well, to give the answer, we have 5,000 graphs that we have as input, and for each of those graphs, so the examples, we want to find a label. So that would be an example of a graph level task. Okay, so this is finished now. We have 50 epochs here. Okay, the accuracy is quite high, 92%. It doesn't mean much because we don't know how easy it is to classify that the data set. But if you run it with a 1D CNN, you can see that we get pretty similar results. So that really maybe some indication that we are sort of doing something very similar. But of course, the CNN does it much faster because we don't need 80 different layers to run it, but just one CNN layer. Okay, so right. That's it. Oh, that doesn't work so well. I think I'll just leave it like this. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, let's think about experiment 1B. So, like I already said before, there's different variants that we have of GCN layer. So, as you can see here in the table below, in the so when this first was introduced, there's actually a range of different propagation models of how a GCN layer could be implemented. The one thing that we looked at right now is the first order model, just because we can use that to emulate a 1D CNN. But what's much more common is the so-called renormalization trick description. Yeah. So this one is quite similar, but instead of the adjacency matrix, we add self loops to the adjacency matrix as a form of the identity matrix, and then we normalize it. And then so this is essentially the renormalization trick GCN layer. Of course, usually would add a non-linearity as well, but yeah. So we want to do this time series classification now with a GCN with a renormalization trick, but we don't want to use the 80 layers that we used before, but maybe just 5 layers, and we try to now have those channels not as separate pathways, but as channels. We actually use the second dimension here, this number of channels dimensions. Okay. Okay, let's just run the second model. You'll see it's quite a bit faster because we only have 2 GCN layers now, and you see that the accuracy is kind of similar, but not quite there. It's maybe 5 to 10 percentage points less. So let's discuss what we've seen. In the first experiment, or 1A, we've seen that okay, we kind of can achieve similar accuracy, but it just happens that it's much slower than a 1D CNN. But the 1D CNN can actually be emulated through the GCN. It's just not very practical, and I mean, this was a very easy case we're looking at in a 1D CNN. So it's probably a lot more complicated when we have more complicated CNNs. Look at the GCN with a renormalization trick. The accuracy is lower. Now the question is this really a problem? No, not really. Like, of course, the CNN is just better if we have a regular structure. But if we don't have a regular structure like this, we just cannot make use of any additional structure. So then here GCNs would be better. Yeah, so it's not really a problem. The other question that we might think of is, okay, we emulated a 1-dimensional CNN through GCN. Can we also emulate a 2-dimensional CNN through GCN? And okay, just maybe I'll skip the 2-dimensional convolutional layer. I would say that the simple answer is no, or at least not in a straightforward way, because if we have a filter here, we can assign a weight to each of those positions. Yeah, but if we try to reach those positions with a graph shift, it's just difficult to define a graph that allows from one node to reach all of those. Yeah, because we can only go in one direction, so to say. And if you go in several directions, then we assign the same weight to several of those nodes. So generally, I'd say it's not possible. Okay, this brings us to a maybe slightly more interesting example. And this is a GCN run on actual graph structured data. And as is common, we use here the GCN with the renormalization trick. The code is again in the same repository, of course. The data set that we are working with now is the sites here data set. This was the data set with the papers and the references. Like for us, that's already included in the Python package Torch Geometric. So, so that's all right. We don't have to download it separately. So is this a graph level, node level, or edge level task? So in experiment 1, we had a graph level task. This would now be a node level task because the graph consists of those papers. And for each paper, we want to, or each node in that graph, we want to find the label. Like which topic is it? Is it this topic or that topic? Okay, so we can just run experiment 2 now. You see it's already a lot more parameters than we had before, about 60,000 parameters. This is going to run for 200 epochs. The accuracy will be close to 70%. This is what was reported in the initial paper. So this is really just implementation of the first GCN model by Goerttler. Okay, here the accuracy is a bit different. I don't know why. When I ran it yesterday, it was quite similar. Okay, maybe I should show you which model that is. Okay, this is now a GCN model with 2 layers that sort of implements the Goerttler paper. But I sort of have this custom implementation of the GCN layer, just so that you can see what we are doing. Okay, we either have the case of no batches or we have the case with batches. If you look at this matrix multiplication here, this is just the matrix multiplication that we of course had here in this GCN layer, the normalization trick. Okay, so this is a custom layer, but we also can use a layer provided by Torch Geometric. So we either have the custom implementation or we use the Torch Geometric implementation, where instead of feeding in the adjacency matrix, we here just feed in the edge indices. So if you have a look at the matrix that we have here, because we have maybe 3,000 papers, the adjacency matrix would be 3,000 by 3,000. But most of the nodes actually only have maybe 5 or 10 papers they reference, well, maybe 20 papers they reference. So we only need to iterate through those 20 papers. So generally, if you have larger graphs, you wouldn't have those adjacency matrices anymore. You just go through all the nodes and look at all the neighbors of the nodes. Okay. Okay, so why not combine several shifts in one layer? So I already mentioned this earlier how it was kind of complicated to emulate a higher order polynomial. Of course, we can do that. This is called a Chebyshev filter. This is also something that we've seen in the previous talk by Fei. Here the like simply you think, okay, we can just use the adjacency matrix here, but actually what turns out to be more numerically stable is if we replace this adjacency matrix with the Laplacian matrix, normalize this matrix, and then reparameterize the polynomial as a Chebyshev polynomial. So this is how we arrive at sort of Chebyshev filter propagation model. Okay, so this was a graph convolutional network, but the talk is about graph neural networks. Actually, the graph convolutional network is just a specific case of the message passing neural network. And the message passing neural network is kind of much more general framework. So here we kind of think we have three different steps. One is the sort of accumulate the messages. The second step we aggregate the messages, and then the third step we do the update. So mathematically, this is what it would look like. We have this function m here that takes as input kind of the data here. But importantly, not just the data on the nodes, but we also have or can put in the edges as input. Yeah, maybe you remember in the molecule data set, it was actually quite important to also consider the edges, because the edges themselves were features. I mean, it isn't just one connection, but connection could be maybe with electrons, or it could be a different type of connection. So the edges themselves are features now. But in our graph evolutionary network, we don't use the edges. We just compute the messages by sort of feeding in the features of each node and computing and use this to sort of compute a message for each node, message that is then sent to the neighboring nodes. So this sending of the messages is the second step, the aggregation step, and we send those messages in the case of the GCN by just using this shift matrix that shifts the messages from one node to the neighboring nodes. And the last step, the update step, is here quite simple. We just have the nonlinearity for the GCN, but of course we can think of more elaborate update steps. Okay, just to summarize, for GNNs, we kind of have three different types of graphs, either graph level task, node level task, or edge level task. The graph level tasks sort of correspond to classification and regression for classical neural networks, and the node level tasks correspond to annotation and segmentation in classical neural networks. So the data, we can have very different scenarios. Like we can either have data that is mostly on the nodes, but the data can also be sort of within the graph structure. The graphs can be large, they can be sparse, they can be binary, like everything's possible. So that means that GNN applications can vary greatly between different fields and different data sets. So we've seen the message passing neural network, just kind of the generalized framework, and the GCN as a sort of specific variation of that message passing neural network. There's also other sort of types of GNNs that I just haven't had time to cover here, which is graph attention networks, graph sage, GIN. You can look all of those up if you're interested. And maybe kind of high level description that we've seen is that CNNs work very well on regular structures, then GNNs more on irregular structures, and if we don't have any structure at all, we use a multi-layer perceptron, MLP, sorry, PNL is switched here. Okay, so in a way, GNNs are kind of not as good as CNNs, but it's just the only thing we can do if we have an irregular structure. So this is why they're still very, very helpful. Okay, and maybe I'll just give you a few more resources here on the last slide. There are very good online resources if you want to know more about graph neural networks, very visual. So there's this one here, A Gentle Introduction to Graph Neural Networks. So not only very visual, but also kind of interactive. Yeah, you can see in some cases you can sort of play around with your mouse, and yeah, that can make things more visual and were easy to understand. So part of the talk was based on those examples here. Okay, and with this, I'd like to end the talk. Thank you. Still have 8 more minutes left. So plenty of time for questions. Yeah.
Sorry, thank you so much for this great presentation. I was just wondering if you're classifying the sleep-wake cycles of like different patients, and each patient is a node. Would that be a node level classification, or
This would be a node level classification, but I would say in this case we probably wouldn't think of the participants as nodes, even though they can be if they're their friends. That probably doesn't have a big impact on the brain processing.
Okay, yeah, very nice stuff.
But it would be node level tasks.
Yes. And if it were like an edge level classification, what would be the scenario in that case, and what would the edge instance be?
It can be anything, like the edges between participants can be relationships. Yeah, there's, I think, many ways there could be a relationship between 2 people. But generally with GNNs, like there's many ways we can have data on the nodes. There's different ways we can look at the edges, and different ways we can look at graphs. So it makes it also a bit challenging to work with GNNs. Yeah.
We use the GCN model, maybe some shallow GCN model, maybe some to extract the semantic feature very good. And if we use the very deep GCN model, maybe we will let the nodes feature over communicate, and then let the feature nodes feature let the spatially. So do you have any trick to design the deeps of GCN?
I think it's probably just looking at how the model behaves. Or maybe we need to look at the data first, and we need to understand the data, and then we can sort of, already before we run it, think about how many layers would be appropriate and where we run into issues of where we run into those issues.
And as you mentioned, some research include the CNN, RNN, and the GCN in the EEG classification task. In my view, I think this model are all the AI black box content.
Yes.
So, do you have any thinking to improve the interpretability in the EEG classification? Because in the cognitive science, things of doctor, if your model can give some interesting output, not just a classification probability, they can explore the reason of the neurological disorders.
Yeah, I think so as well. Like it's GNNs just make models kind of more complex, and that just means that they are more difficult to understand. But I guess if done in the right way, we can effectively use them and understand how they work, and maybe also understand.
Yeah, okay. Because your research in the map, I think it's a very good idea. Thank you.
Sorry, my last question.
No, that's all right.
So I was just wondering if there is a difference in the amount of data required for, say, a CNN versus GNN, like more data.
I would say probably we need more data, but kind of where the data is quite different. Like the data would be maybe more on the nodes, on the graph. I think it's always best to understand the data as good as we can before designing.
I think there are some questions.
Yeah.
That's the point. We'll have to stop sharing and just go to the top.
Okay.
see. Okay. And then let's go for
Scroll to the top.
Q&A. I see.
Maybe you can use this one.
This is. Yeah, I'm not sure if this is recording. So is this recording?
They were recording, yeah.
Okay. Recording.
Somebody put a message up that these sessions as a YouTube
Okay.
channel for these
Yes,
sessions.
probably the organizer probably recording.
Okay. Yeah.
So not another question. Do you have a method to interpret EEG signals spatially?
Yeah, I've already answered that question.
Oh, okay.
Okay, I think it's just one question that I'm able to see here. Key difference in approach between edge level learning and learning weights. I think in the example I showed, it is we are kind of learning weights, but because the graph just looks so different, it's we just use these graph neural network approaches instead of more classical approaches. Yeah, the other thing is that, of course, those weights in some situations they're binary, like for the social network, Facebook social network, the friendships are just binary, they're either there or they're not. But in other cases, those connections would be weighted, of course. And then it's harder to say whether those graphs are actually sparse or not. Like we would need to do thresholding to maybe make them sparse. Yes. One more question here. Would each channel be the node? Yes, each EEG channel would be the node. So for everyone not coming from EEG, it might be confusing. Channels in EEG mean the sensors, or maybe two sensors put together can also be a channel. But this is of course different than the channels we have in machine learning. Related, but yeah. Here the channels would be the nodes, yes. Okay, if there's no more questions, I think it's one.
Yeah, the presentation was very well explained. I have a question about the sparse thing actually. So in the graph level experiment, you said one CN, one GCN was performing well than GCN. Do you think if the graph was sparse, then GCN will be more appropriate than one GCN?
Here, the reason why the CNN works so well is because we can make use of this highly structured, like a graph. It is graph. It is a graph, and we pass the graph to the model, and we did the graph convolutional network. But of course, if we have more structure available, then we should be able to use it. And in this case, we didn't really make use of the graph structure. So that's why the CNN here was better in that sense.
Perhaps we can thank the speaker.
Yeah.